Welcome to Dr. Lottie's Science with Soul. I'm Dr. Lottie and the host of this podcast. Today, I am so excited and honored to introduce Dr. Eben Alexander III. Academic neurosurgeon Dr. Eben Alexander III, whose career includes decades as a physician and associate professor at Harvard Medical School and revered teaching hospitals, was once staunchly committed to the materialist worldview, the belief that the physical world is all that exists. His scientific belief system was altered by his 2008 transcendental near-death experience, an odyssey into another realm during a week-long coma. Despite a bleak medical prognosis, Dr. Alexander awoke to make an inexplicable return to full health. His medical case and recovery were validated in the peer-reviewed Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease. Since his near-death experience, Dr. Alexander has been reconciling his rich spiritual experience with quantum physics, cosmology, and philosophy of mind. Dr. Alexander speaks around the world to educate about the role that consciousness plays in wellness, healing, and recovery. A pioneering scientist and modern thought leader, Dr. Alexander has been featured in more than 400 media interviews, including for ABC TV's Good Morning America in 2020, The Dr. Oz Show, Oprah's Super Soul Sunday, Larry King Now, Fox and Friends, Discovery Channel, Biography Channel, and numerous international radio, digital, and podcasts. His books are available in more than 40 countries. Proof of Heaven in Neurosurgeon's Journey into the Afterlife, The Map of Heaven, How Science, Religion, and Ordinary People are Proving the Afterlife, and Living in a Mindful Universe, a Neurosurgeon's Journey into the Heart of Consciousness, co-authored with Sacred Acoustics co-founder Karen Newell. So welcome, Dr. Alexander. It's such an honor to have you as a guest today.
Well, Dr. Lottie, it's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
You have such a unique story and experience to share. And I remember when you first had your near-death experience and it became public knowledge. And I remember telling my family how excited I was that a brain surgeon from Harvard University had this near-death experience, because it would help so many people and bring credibility to the fact that we are divine creatures. So for the listeners who are not familiar with what happened to you and how you ended up in a situation where you had a near-death experience, can you please just share briefly what happened and what you experienced during this near-death experience?
Okay, I think it's important to point out I'd spent the first 54 years of my life honing a very kind of conventional scientific worldview. So I wanted to believe much of what I'd heard in church as a youth, but through much of my career as a neurosurgeon, I just couldn't understand how the consciousness could survive the death of the brain and body. That was a real mystery to me. And that's why I had the experience was, these are always tailored for the individual, in spite of the fact that, millions and millions of NDEs have common elements to them. So they suggest a very real realm out there, the one that is in many ways more real than this one. And yet it seems so foreign to our way of thinking. And for me as a conventional neuroscientist, it was an eye opener. It's absolutely not what you would expect as a materialist who falsely believes that the brain creates consciousness. What I came to realize, and I think one of the reasons my story is so important to the scientific community and the medical community at large, as witnessed through that case report that came out in September 2018 in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, that made it clear that my brain was in no shape to have any kind of dream or hallucination. So where this extraordinarily rich and memorable and detailed experience came from certainly cannot be answered from within conventional neuroscience. The other thing the case report makes very clear is that my recovery is totally unexpected. I mean, that's one thing. If people understand enough about the medical records in that case report, they realize this case really has no precedent in the medical literature. Now, there are other cases of miraculous healing in near-death experiences, but that's a separate topic. That is simply pointing out that NDEs can be associated with dramatic healing that goes far beyond anything we can explain in medicine. So getting back to your question, the most important thing to point out about my experience was that I was amnesic for the life of Eben Alexander. That's unusual in an NDE, that I went through the entire experience not remembering my life as Eben Alexander, not having any words or language, knowledge of earth, humanity, etc. All was gone. And that was important, I came to realize in the months and year or two after my coma, because it helped to set the stage for giving me something I had to appreciate the reality of. Because if I'd scripted it, my father, for example, who had passed over 4 years earlier, had been there, I would have been more likely, in spite of 1 in 10 million diagnosis of E. coli meningitis, and in spite of 1 in billion recovery that I had, I would have been tempted to dismiss it as, wow, it was way too real to be real, but how do you explain it? And that's why the real nuts and bolts of the story are so important. And that's what I shared in Proof of Heaven. Essentially, my journey went through 3 different phases, and I went through them many, many times, cycling through these realms, beginning in the earthworm's eye view, a very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm. But I was rescued from that by this slowly spinning white light that served as a portal up into this much rich, vibrant, alive realm that I call the Gateway Valley. That had many Earth-like features. I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. I never had any body awareness at all. There were thousands of beings dancing in this beautiful meadow down below, lush with life, all this blossoms, buds on trees, flowers blooming, incredible beauty. It was like a Plato's world of ideals, but for the individual soul. There was no sign of any death or decay. And the most beautiful part about it was I wasn't alone on that butterfly wing. There was a beautiful woman, and she's a central feature of my journey, and proves very important because many months later, when I finally discovered her identity, I realized all of this was real and really happened, just as it seemed to be too real to be real. It was shockingly real, and at a time when my brain was demonstrated to have no ability to construct such a vision. So this middle realm, this Gateway Valley, the reassuring message from the spiritual guide, the beautiful woman on the butterfly wing, you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are deeply cared for. All delivered telepathically is this emotionally pure message where I identified with her being and knew the truth of what she was saying. Now, all of that beautiful scenery was just the setting stage for the next phase of the journey, because all the joy and merriment I was seeing in that realm, in the Gateway Valley, were being fueled because of these angelic choirs above that were swooping and emanating chants and anthems and hymns that would just thunder through my awareness. And it turns out that those angelic choirs provided yet another portal up into higher and higher levels. And I remember seeing all of our 4-dimensional space-time collapsing down, all of the spiritual realm, and that a different ordering of causality and what I call deep time, all of that collapsing down as I came all the way out into what I call the core. Infinite inky blackness, but filled to overflowing with a healing, wholesome love of that divine creative force of God. And when I came back to this world, I knew that God was absolutely one of love, compassion, kindness, and mercy, the same God I had studied in my Christian upbringing. But I realized that to try and pretend that God was limited to one faith would be ridiculous. That in fact, I came back seeing that God force of love and compassion and mercy, kindness, acceptance, forgiveness, etc., was one that, if you call Brahman, God, Allah, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit, doesn't matter, because essentially they're all referring to the same fundamental force of love and connection that we all share. And NDEs make this crystal clear. In fact, NDEs should take us out of the dark ages of competing religions and take us into an era where we really kind of focus more on the actual message of the prophets about love and compassion and kindness and connectedness. And that was the deepest lesson I learned from this journey. Now, I cycled through these, as I said, many times. I've talked at more than 500 presentations, conferences, and everything to share so much of the many different lessons. Of course, we can kind of cherry pick what we want to talk about next. But the important thing to remember is I was told in the core, you're not here to stay. And in the core realm, important to point out, that was a true spiritual home, absolute oneness with that divine. And this is far beyond any little ego mind, identifying with that oneness of God, but really the much grander aspect of our shared spirit and that kind of common, the unconscious that we share, as Carl Jung surmised. But really coming back to this world, my brain was absolutely wrecked. And the other thing that I mentioned in Proof of Heaven was that after I came back to this world, and that happened because at the very end of the journey, I witnessed 6 faces that would kind of bubble up out of the muck and then disappear. They'd say a few words. And I didn't recognize who they were, and I couldn't understand the words, but they're burned into my memory visually, just like so much of the journey was. So within hours, as I did come back to this world, because the 6th face was what really brought me back. It was the face of a 10-year-old boy. It was my son Bond. I did not recognize him. My brain was still too ravaged by the disease. But he had heard the doctors say I'd gone from a 10% chance of survival to 2%. That was in a family conference on day 7 of Coma, Sunday morning. They had protected Bond from the worst news, but he overheard that, and he knew now things were very dire. He came running down into ICU bed 10, where I'd been on a ventilator for the whole week on 3 very powerful intravenous antibiotics, but not showing signs of improvement. And he pulled open my eyelids, one eye looking over there, another eye over there, neither pupil working. As a physician, you know what a bad sign that is. That is not of anybody who is close to this earth, somebody who's trying to check out. And I promise you, I didn't hear him with my ears or see him with my eyes, but he's pleading with me, Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. Somehow I knew I had to come back for this soul. I was still subject to the amnesia, not remembering anything of Eben Alexander's life. That's why I didn't recognize him and the other faces that were so important. But I knew that I had a responsibility to him. And so I came back to this world of, struggling my way back, not understanding how to do that, but being led back by my higher soul and this kind of collection of beautiful, loving forces that I encountered during the journey. And it took me 2 months to really recover. All my memories come back and all that. In fact, when I first woke up in that ICU room, I didn't even recognize my mother, my sons, my former spouse, my sisters, all at the bedside. I had no idea who these beings were. But memories came back very rapidly, especially language over hours and days, childhood memories and knowing of all these people around me within days and a week or so, and then all the somatic knowledge over about 2 months. And then the journey really began, and that was very extensive. Reading NDEs after I'd written the first 20,000 words of my own memories, because my older son, majoring in neuroscience, advised me, write it all down before you read anyone else's NDE. And I'm glad he advised that, because that's exactly what I did. And then the 13 years since then have been an amazing journey of discovery. I've gotten into meditation. I meditate an hour or 2 a day using sacred acoustics. And it's a very powerful technique to reunite with my NDE. And as you mentioned early on, I've now written 3 books about it because I work with scientists around the world. So this has a lot to do with my evolving understanding of the nature of consciousness, the mind-brain relationship, and what we all need to understand about our capacities to heal ourselves, the power of free will of the higher soul, which is, I think, the greatest gift that I've received from this huge journey of exploration in the years since my NDE.
And when you were in this coma, did the hospital doctors do any kind of monitoring of your brain? Did they have any proof that you didn't have brain activity?
Well, it's mainly the neurologic exams. I mean, if you read that medical case report, and certainly if you go through my medical records, the simplest way to put it is the Glasgow coma scale. the GCS, which for you or me right now would be 15. If we had a corpse in the room, the corpse would get 3 points. Anything below 9 is deep coma. And for the vast majority of my week in coma, other than one time in the emergency room where I said, God help me, I do not remember saying those words. All I'd done was kind of groan and scream and moan. Otherwise, I was in coma and seizing and unresponsive. That initially gave me a score of 11, but my score in the ER, other than that, was more like 6 or 7. And that's where it stayed most of that week, and probably dipped down to 5, according to the nursing notes at certain points. So I was in deep coma. The scan, CT, MRI scan, showed all 8 lobes of my brain were very impacted by this disease. There was no place where the neocortex was relatively spared that would have allowed for any kind of detailed conscious experience to be generated. And I think that's one reason. In fact, when Dr. Serbi Khanna and Lauren Moore and Bruce Grayson submitted the case report to the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, they were challenged by the peer reviewers. How do you explain this case? You know, they called it absurd, the reviewers did, because they'd never seen that kind of severe case of bacterial meningoencephalitis where the patient ended up making a full recovery. And when they challenged the doctors about that, the response from the doctors was, well, he had the near-death experience. And to us, that is what explains this miraculous recovery. They knew of similar cases of miraculous recovery, like Anita Moorjani, who had her lymphoma disappear after a profound near-death experience, or Dr. Mary C. Neal, orthopedic surgeon who had a over 30-minute warm water drowning in a kayaking accident in Chile back in the late 1990s. You don't recover from that. You know, over 30-minute drowning episode in warm water doesn't happen. And yet she did. She had a profound recovery. And so the peer reviewers at the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases were satisfied with that answer, which shows you the medical profession is making tremendous strides when they acknowledge that such rich, multi-faceted spiritual journeys can actually participate in our healing.
So now that you had this experience, I can imagine what you thought before the experience. What creates, does the brain create the consciousness, like a lot of people think? So what is your view on that now after your near-death experience? What is consciousness?
Well, it's something that we go into in much detail in our 3rd book, Living in a Mindful Universe, that was co-written with Karen Newell. But it really has to do with evolving philosophical systems that, I've been involved with scientists and philosophers around the world in this challenge for the last 13 years or so. And that a lot of that is reflected in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, which is endorsed by many of those leading scientific minds like Ed Kelly, Bruce Grayson, Jim Tucker, Bernardo Kastrup, Pim Van Lommel, Larry Dossey. I mean, the list goes on and on of scientists who study consciousness. But basically, to cut to the chase, there really has to be a model here where consciousness is primordial. And that's what I believe is going on. That is, consciousness is something that pre-exists, for example, the physical universe that we currently view as created at the time of the Big Bang. And this thing called consciousness is actually bigger and grander than that. Sentient beings have brains that allow us to tap into that mental layer of the universe. It's a layer of information assimilation and integration that basically is the mind of the universe itself. And has a lot to do with the evolving realities of this universe. But the more we come to understand this, I would say for years now, I've said that my position and what we defend in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is a metaphysical position of objective idealism. That is the primacy of consciousness. And in our book, we explain, especially in the primordial mind hypothesis, as we call it, how this primordial mind can manifest through the quantum states of the physical substance of the brain to give us this apparent emergent reality. And I think that's really the best way to look at it. So that all the empirical data that supports not only near-death experiences, but shared death experiences, things like precognition and presentiment, that we have a way of knowing the future at least seconds and minutes in advance, telepathy, which is a very real phenomenon, uh, remote viewing, which has been scientifically validated, a technique to discern information across time and space. And then, of course, all the tremendous after-death communications, and then stories, say, of past life memories in children, suggestive of reincarnation, as the 2,500 plus cases studied over the last 6 decades at the University of Virginia. People can learn a lot more about that at uvadops.org. But all of these pieces of information need to be brought together into a gigantic model of what's really going on in brain and mind and with consciousness and phenomenal reality. And that's where I think this objective idealism is a beautiful path forward. To be more refining about it, if we really had time to get into the discussion, I would refine it beyond idealism, which is simply saying that the mental aspect of the universe has some primacy in causing everything that unfolds in this world, and say that my position now, kind of strictly speaking, from a philosophical perspective, would be that of evolutionary panentheism. Which for me is just a more modified form of putting the mental layer of the universe in charge, but acknowledging that God force that so many NDEers, prophets, mystics, spontaneous epiphanies and meditation, etc. People have encountered that God force of love and compassion, kindness in many different ways. And all it does is acknowledge the reality of that, and that our mind, in essence, as I came to see in my own NDE, has its very source in that God force of pure love that so many NDEers have bathed in during their journey. And the evolutionary part of the panentheism is just that God force of consciousness is in all of this reality that we witness. Evolutionary means we do have free will. You know, the materialist model that I worship before my coma falsely thinks that we do not have free will. One of the most ridiculous positions imaginable, that we can sit here and using our free will, we can choose whether or not we have free will. I mean, come on, let's get real about this. And with evolutionary panentheism or with objective idealism, you certainly open the door to the free will of the mental layer of the universe, and simply acknowledge that sentient beings can access that through our brain that is a filter or transceiver for that primordial mind.
So how would you then differentiate between mind and brain?
Well, the brain is the physical stuff, the 3.5-pound gelatinous mass sitting in a warm, dark bath between my ears. That's the brain. Mind is not so confined. In fact, mind can encompass everything from before the Big Bang to beyond the heat death, end of the universe, and all throughout the universe. Mind has access to every bit of that. The more we kind of explore through meditation and other techniques, we can find that we have tremendous access within mind. So mind is far grander. And in fact, I used to think brain creates mind. I now realize that's false. That in fact, mind and the layer of consciousness, the mental layer of the universe, is what creates all of this emergent reality. This physical universe actually emerges from the mental. And this is where things like healing and a discussion of free will are so important. You know, in medical science, we've honored placebo effect for more than 6 decades as the gold standard by which to assess any new treatment modality. And placebo effect is nothing more than an admission from medical scientists that our thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes play a tremendous role in our unfolding health and healing. And it goes far beyond just, taking a sugar pill for a headache. If you go to noetic.org, the Institute of Noetic Sciences website, put in the search term spontaneous remission, you'll uncover a book that they published in the mid-1990s with more than 3,500 cases of people who healed their own cancer, advanced infections, even congenital anomalies that they've been born with, et cetera, all laid out in detail in this book that is still available. You can download it for free from their website. It's legal, it's their book. The good news is they're now updating that database with 30 plus years of more data. I cannot wait to see that. And just as an example, Kelly Turner wrote a beautiful book based on 1,000+ cancer cases from that database, where she basically discerned 6 of 9 features that people use to help them in this healing of advanced diseases. And 6 of them were spiritual. They had to do with our emotional health, with working through, and accepting and growing from our negative emotions, with cultivating our positive emotions, developing a reason, purpose for living, a more spiritual approach to life. I mean, all of this is about acknowledging kind of power of prayer and our abilities to really heal ourselves. And that's where I think this revolution, our understanding of the mind-brain relationship and the nature of consciousness is most important, because this world is ailing, and many of us are ailing with the world. Physical, mental, and emotional healing is ultimately spiritual in nature. And when I use this word spiritual, I don't necessarily mean religious, although many people can use religion to get there. But just going within, developing a practice of meditation and not letting your little ego mind run the show. In any kind of alcoholism or addiction work, you find that often the ego is the problem. And what I often teach people in meditation, especially around this kind of healing, is that little voice in your head is not who you are. That's a voice of your ego, your consciousness. I love how Michael Singer puts it in his book, The Untethered Soul. He calls that the annoying roommate. Yes, absolutely. And through meditation, we can discover a far grander sense of a higher self, interconnected with this universe in very meaningful fashion. And that's where we start to really get the benefit of this kind of awakening of our understanding of the brain-mind relationship and nature of reality.
So when you look at the universe, do you look at that as a physical place or more of a mental place?
I see it as completely driven by spirit. And I see the beauty of the kind of physical universe that unfolds. And I know the laws of physics are very important for understanding this. Quantum physics is right at the head of the pack in terms of deeper understanding of the mind-brain relationship. Because essentially, as John Wheeler pointed out, John Wheeler was the head of physics at Princeton, mid-20th century, a renowned quantum physicist. And he came up with a participatory anthropic principle, which was this major admission of the primacy of mind, that the mind of the scientist plays a tremendous role in the unfolding reality. And even though he didn't really see a way towards the deep solutions that we can start to see today, he certainly painted a picture that made it important to understand the primacy of mind. And that's what I see as so crucial in understanding all of this. I see what we look at as Earth time, this evolution of time marching in our physical universe, in many ways it supports the drama, but it's part of the fiction. There's a deeper ordering of causality that is apparent in meditation, in near-death experiences, et cetera, where we're completely outside of that notion of here and now. That's why things like life reviews are common in near-death experiences. The life review is not just remembering events of your life, but reliving them. And reliving them in intense detail, and often from the perspective, the emotional perspective of those around us who were affected by our thoughts and actions. So the life review is a beautiful example of how this little myth of, my mind is mine and mine alone and separate from the universe is not true. We are sharing the one mind. There's a beautiful book that was written by a colleague, Dr. Larry Dossey, called One Mind, that I always recommend to people on this. And it's not just about humans sharing a mind. We share mind with animals and even with the plant life of this world. It's something about life itself that allows this beautiful kind of access to that mental layer of the universe. And that is something we share. But that's really how I see the universe at large. And I see what we see is this kind of, the moment-to-moment physical universe obeying physical laws is really something that is truly just the stage setting on which the drama unfolds. But through meditation, NDEs, and other epiphanies, we can realize the much grander kind of scaling of time and space to which we have access.
Now, to go back to the actual NDE, so some people, even scientists and doctors, and myself included before I had my own near-death experience, if somebody told me about their near-death experience, I would say, oh, it's, the lack of oxygen, or, it's just what the brain does when it's dying. And then you have the experience and then you realize that's not so. So what do you have? How can you explain that to people that think that?
Well, for one thing, I mean, start with the shared death experience. I had many, many people, I've talked to more than 150,000 people in groups and conferences, et cetera, sharing my story. And I've had hundreds and hundreds of those people come up and share their own near-death experience with me. Well, I'd say about 1 in 20 of those was actually a shared death experience. They're just like near death, but they happen to somebody who's usually very healthy. A loved one, the loved one can be at the bedside of the dying patient. The loved one can be 2,000 miles away, doesn't matter. But their soul gets carried along on the journey. And shared death experiences are out there in huge numbers now, too. In fact, if you go to a Shared Crossing project, William Peters, just Google that, go to I think it's sharedcrossing.org or something like that, Santa Barbara, California. He just put out a book 2 weeks ago on Heaven's Door is the name of the book. It's an excellent book. I highly recommend it. It's all about shared death. And those simplistic little, oxygen tension, CO2, blah, 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 none of that applies in shared death cases. So, and I think the other thing to point out here is there's a giant motherlode of information that's just come to the fore that fully supports the reality of NDEs and the afterlife in a scientific setting. It supports reincarnation too. That's a contest that was held BigelowInstitute.org. Robert Bigelow, who is an aerospace entrepreneur in Las Vegas, hosted a contest in the year 2020. They had over 1,000 applicants. 204 groups were invited to submit reports because they proved that they had been studying the afterlife for more than 5 years. And of those 204, 29 papers were selected as winners. And those papers are available for free to the public at large. Everyone on earth should go there, BigelowInstitute.org. You can start with just the #1 paper by Jeffrey Mishlove. It's an exceptional paper, as are all of them. They're all very, very good. But there's no more time for, anybody who claims to be a scientist or a doctor who takes care of dying patients to be ignorant of this willfully. No, that data is there. And beyond any reasonable doubt, as you read those papers, any rational thinking person will come to know, of course, these stories are real. They show us something very real about the afterlife, about our souls having an eternity that also can involve reincarnation, like the UVA database that has more than 2,500 such cases over the last 6 decades. So it's no longer a question of, are these events real or made up hallucinations? That's gone the way of the dodo, because in fact, anybody who claims to be scientific in the modern era needs to be aware of these papers, have read them, understand them, and the reality is the afterlife and these NDE stories show us something very real about human existence, and it's time for all of us to take them seriously and learn the lessons they teach, because our very survival as a species, and certainly for many of us individually, will be greatly enhanced by this kind of knowledge.
Wow, that's just great. I love how you have all the resources and you can just share them with all the listeners, and so they know where to go to find this information, because it's a question that comes up all the time, being an NDEer myself. Now, some people do psychedelic drugs or ayahuasca, and they have experiences that are very similar to near-death experiences. Is there a difference between the two?
Yes, I would say, first of all, I was accused early on. I think Sam Harris made a big deal of how my description of my NDE sounded to him exactly like a DMT trip. Okay. And so the scientific side of me wanted to assess that. I ended up under medical supervision trying out 5-methoxy DMT, which is the most powerful form of dimethyltryptamine. And what I can tell you is that I do believe that such substances, and I call them entheogens, I do not call them hallucinogens. That's a terrible word. It has nothing to do with what they're really revealing. Psychedelics is an okay word, but plant medicine or entheogens is a much better word. And for me, I think they do give us a tiny glimpse of the NDE territory, but it was like looking through a small keyhole and trying to discern something on the other side. Whereas the NDE, which is a natural, organic way of this unfolding with one's soul journey, is like a panoramic penthouse view of the entire landscape. So I believe you can get a lot closer to NDEs through meditation than through the use of plant medicines and entheogens. Although I will point out, from my perspective, it's very important that research is now being done with these entheogens again for two reasons. One is something that we discuss in detail in Living in Mindful Universe, and that is the scientific study with functional MRI, magnetoencephalography, all the ways that we can really look at the way the brain is working in the moment, show us that when you take, for example, psilocybin or LSD or DMT, ayahuasca, things like that, that the brain actually goes dark. There's no part of the brain that increases in activity to match with that extraordinary phenomenal experience that you have with such plant medicines. It's just showing us paper after paper, as we talk about in Living in a Mindful Universe, show us that the brain is not getting more active to explain those experiences. It's getting out of the way. That's the filter theory at work. That's exactly what we propose in Living in a Mindful Universe, is how the brain interacts with consciousness. The other crucial thing about the scientific study of entheogens today is some beautiful work being done out of Johns Hopkins, NYU, and other places where I think Roland Griffiths is one of the main investigators to mention to people. But they've used, for example, psilocybin in treating addiction, serious addiction, alcoholism, things like nicotine addiction, which is one of the toughest physiologic addictions, opioids, et cetera, and using psilocybin to treat fear of death, a debilitating fear of death in terminal cancer patients. Turns out that 1 or 2 doses in the proper therapeutic setting and months and years of cure are available. So in other words, the psilocybin doesn't act as something you take every day or routinely to help you in this healing. You take it once or twice with a proper therapeutic setting. And I would say you can get the same thing done through meditation, because we see that in a lot of our workshops, that people are able to get the same kind of result done in dealing with their own hardships, addictions, alcoholism, fear of death, whatever it might be. And what we're doing is thinning the veil. So whether it's that 1 or 2 doses of psilocybin or the meditation, we're just thinning the veil and allowing our connection to that higher soul. And that's where we can come into true healing.
So just to switch topic a little bit, do you think that we have something called life contracts or certain lessons that we're supposed to learn in the life that we're living right now?
Yes, I fully believe I know the work of Robert Schwartz, Michael Newton, Brian Weiss. These are brilliant clinical investigators who realized that their patients were through either an NDE or through hypnotic regression or through meditation or prayer and epiphany, but that they were actually kind of living a life now that reflected challenges and issues from a previous lifetime. And the field is called transpersonal psychology. I would say a lot of it got started with Carl Jung back in the mid-20th century. Stan Grof was a great investigator. He used LSD back when it was legal in the 60s, but then he moved to something called hypertrophic breath work that he used to induce transcendental states of conscious awareness. But all these brilliant investigators came to realize that past life memories figured into the issues of this life. And the best way to deal with the issues of this life were to be cognizant and aware and interactive with kind of the higher soul and those issues of past life. So I would agree with you that in many ways, I think our soul groups, we get together. I mean, that's what people describe in the hospice setting and NDE, shared death, et cetera, is reconnecting with souls of departed loved ones, going through those life reviews. The life review is like a mid-course correction. And we find out if we've been handing out a lot of pain and suffering to others, it doesn't feel good when you feel it during your life review. And therefore, it gently nudges us towards a refinement of treating others as we would like to be treated. The golden rule is written into the fabric of the universe. That's what we often say around this discussion of life reviews. And I believe, for example, that some of my own issues, I struggled with alcohol when I was younger, and early in my career, I never had any trouble at work, but early in my career in 1991, I stopped drinking alcohol, and that was with help from family and friends and all of that. But to me, it was a gift, not just the getting away from the alcohol, but the fact that I struggled with it in the first place was part of my soul growth. I had to face that and come to grow through it. I would say other challenges in my life are the same way. I look at, for example, the hardship, I might have called it a hardship before my coma, of having a should have killed me bacterial meningoencephalitis in November 2008. I look at that as a tremendous gift. Now, you could argue, well, it's a gift because you came back. Well, yes, that's true. And because I came back and learned a fantastic lesson about healing and about our abilities to influence healing, the more we manifest love, kindness, compassion for others. That's how we can truly do this. But I believe that all those lessons in many ways were something that my higher soul and soul group basically agreed on. I now think that our free will is manifested by how we respond to many of those challenges in our life. But I would say that in some deep sense, I think many of the challenges we kind of set up as higher soul before we came here. I know, for example, Anita Moorjani often talks similarly about how her own fear of cancer is why she had the cancer. And unfortunately, in trying to share the message openly with people, some people get a little angry when they say, wait a minute, you're saying I caused my cancer or I caused my child to commit suicide or something crazy like that. And their ego mind, of course, cannot hear that and will not accept it. But the reality is we're more than our ego mind. And I think the more people can get out of that little ego voice in their head, and through meditation and centering prayer and the various ways of quieting that voice and developing a relationship with that kind of primordial consciousness, that God force of the universe, that's where we start to see a pathway forward. And that's where we start to have the kind of vision that can encompass that maybe I did select those hardships because I have grown. I have the potential to grow tremendously through the hardships, depending on how I face them. But, we also have the option not to grow and to come back and reshuffle those same issues in another lifetime. I'd rather not do that. I'd rather get through as much of that karma as I can this lifetime. And that involves developing this much richer sense of identity with the universe.
I couldn't agree more. I always say that I am not redoing my life. It's been way, way too many obstacles and healing adventures. I'm going to get it all right. I'm going to learn as much as I can because my next life I'm not going to deal with any of the issues I had in this life. I definitely share your view of that and how we incarnate, maybe with some kind of a soul contract, but the free will is still present.
Right.
So now that you came back and you're very spiritual and you grew up as a Christian, are you still part of a specific religion, or is it difficult to be part of a religion after you have a near-death experience?
Well, I'll put it this way. I think that everything that I learned in my NDE and that I've learned from other NDEers and from studying the phenomenon and from studying consciousness at large, every bit of it is aligned with the kind of love, compassion, and kindness that I was taught in a Methodist church growing up, and that I then followed through in adulthood in an Episcopal church. However, and I will also admit that Jesus is often right there in my prayers. But most importantly to state here is I also know, for example, Anita Moorjani is a very good friend, and we've presented with her many times. She had a beautiful NDE with an infinitely loving God that brought her back with healing. She had grown up Hindu. I'm not about to deny the powerful reality of her experience. Likewise, for many other faiths. And it became clear to me when I came back that, if you wanted to discuss whether to call that force of love and compassion, kindness, and mercy God, Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit. I don't care what words you use, but don't fool yourself into thinking that some human-made religion is going to be ideal. From my point of view, NDEs really point the way. And there's an excellent book by Robert Koppes, Coppes. It's called The Essence of Religions. He's the head of the Netherlands IONS group. He's had his own NDE, and he's written a beautiful book that compares the 5 major faiths of the world and shows how all of them come kind of close to this, but none of them get it just right. And that NDEs in many ways should shape our religions moving forward to really unify their focus on love, compassion, kindness, acceptance, mercy, taking care of the least, the last, the lost. This is all about caring for each other. And to me, that message is writ large in many great faiths. It certainly is totally consistent with what I grew up with in terms of a Christian faith. For those who worry, oh my gosh, reincarnation, Christianity, just go read Dr. Herb Puryear's book, Why Jesus Taught Reincarnation. And you'll realize how Jesus of Nazareth knew well that reincarnation was a real phenomenon. In the book of Mark, a discussion of King Herod talks about John the Baptist being a reincarnation of the prophet Elias. But the reality is the scientific study at UVA has more than 2,500 cases over 6 decades that show reincarnation to be real. And that those BigelowInstitute.org papers, many of them refer to the reincarnation literature. It's a very important part of this discussion. But I think that's that's how a lot of my thinking has changed. And it really is about, I'm not what you would call a universalist so much as one who just acknowledges that the original message of the prophets, as is often mentioned by the Baha'i faith, is really a unifying message of oneness, and that the kingdom of God is within us all. That was something that Jesus of Nazareth definitely brought to this world. So I just think that when we get into religious bickering, it's a giant waste of time. And it's especially astonishing to me that in the world of NDEs that so dynamically prove the reality of an afterlife and a loving God, that many church fathers would still say, oh, NDEs are the devil's work. It's like they're scared of anybody having an authentic spiritual experience. I don't know why, but to have it all depend on scriptures that are 2,000 years old, when it can depend on dynamic real life experiences of hundreds of thousands of people living today, why not go with the latter? Go with the current dynamic information that supports the reality of all this. And I think that's the way forward for all religions.
So now that we have so many people around the world that are having these near-death experiences, how do you envision the future of humanity?
Well, I'm actually very optimistic about the future of humanity. And this is something that we get into in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. And that's because I believe that this awakening that I'm talking about is really happening. I mean, those Bigelow papers are not, they might not have been publicized much yet, but when people read them, they're going to realize this is all absolutely real. It doesn't have to do with your kind of questioning, are these hallucinations or, people imagining this or making it up, because the evidence is far too strong to the contrary. These are absolutely real experiences. They dovetail perfectly with work in hospice and terminal care patients, like the book Death is But a Dream by Kerr, Kerr is his last name. Sorry? Kerr, Kerr, I'm being informed. But anyway, Death is But a Dream came out in the last year or two. Excellent book on the hospice work, which points to the very same things happening. Identical visions, identical experiences. And so let's all just get on board with the reality. If you want to know what happens when people die, pay attention to people who are dying and to people who are studying all of this consciousness in a big way. And so I see the world as changing dramatically, waking up. I don't think anybody will doubt the reality of this over the next decade or so, because this information has been so well scientifically studied and vetted. And that will be a turning point for this world. I see so many of the bad things of this world, the economic polarization, the warfare, conflict, violence against others, climate change with corporate greed, all of this really bad stuff going on in the world is from materialist science and its false sense of separation. We are not separate. The quantum informed consciousness of today is all about how we're in this together. And the NDE is the tip of the spear showing us the reality of our sharing of this one mind. And when we leave the physical brain and body, we're liberated from the shackles of that prison. I think the awareness of all of this is going to change the world for the better. We're going to come much more into harmony, prosperity, taking care of each other, and really manifesting that binding force of love that is so apparent in NDEs and other spiritually transformative experiences. And we can all benefit from that kind of knowledge and understanding.
That's just wonderful. And this brings me back to the books that you have written. So you've written 3 books. And one was The Proof of Heaven, one was The Map of Heaven, and then the last one, Living in a Mindful Universe. Can you just briefly touch upon what each of those books are about and where people can find them?
Yes, well, Proof of Heaven, important to point out for anybody who missed it at the time, was it really kind of broke records for an NDE book. I had no idea that would happen. In fact, when I went public with a story, basically I saw great risk to my neurosurgical career. That's what I saw. But luckily, the team at Simon & Schuster was very good, and it hit the ground running. The first week it was out, it was the #1 nonfiction title on the New York Times bestseller list. It spent most of the next 2 years on that list, including 42 weeks where it was the #1 nonfiction title. No NDE book had ever remotely come close to that. It's been published in over 40 languages around the world. The reason I stress all this is because thousands of people have been in touch with me because it resonated with the experience they had. They read that book and they knew that was a home. It was a real experience and they wanted to share that with me. That's the biggest gift to me, is they share the stories back, which confirms the reality of all this many times over. Now, the second book, Map of Heaven, well, it came out a few years later, and that was really I was giving hundreds of talks each year about all this. And the feedback was very strongly, this happened to you, this big Harvard neurosurgeon. And I'm going, no. That's one NDE. All of them are important. All of these thousands of NDEs I was becoming aware of, they're all important. And so Map of Heaven is really to make the case. For one thing, we go into much more discussion of reincarnation in that book, which is important. In terms of the overall big picture of all this. But it really, the continuation of my story, the sequel, the true sequel of my personal story to Proof of Heaven, is the third book, Living in a Mindful Universe. That book was co-written with my life partner, Karen Newell. Full disclosure, she is the co-founder of Sacred Acoustics, and people can learn a lot more about binaural beat brainwave entrainment on her website, sacredacoustics.com. I'm their biggest fan. In fact, I encourage them to form a company because I use Sacred Acoustics an hour to a day. I've done that for more than the last 11 years or so, to return to my NDE and to develop a richer relationship with all that. But the third book is really 2 major gifts to the world. One is it brings together the scientific models and scientific knowledge. And this comes from my work with hundreds of scientists around the world who study consciousness, in coming up with a theoretical model, a system that would support all this. And this book has been endorsed by some of the leading thought leaders in the consciousness movement today. People like Bernardo Kastrup, Ed Kelly, Jim Tucker, Larry Dossey, Bruce Grayson. I mean, the list goes on and on. And if you go to ebenalexander.com, the books are listed there separately. You can go to Living in a Mindful Universe and very quickly see all the scientific endorsers for this work. And so it's not only the scientific picture to help people get on board with how the mind-brain relationship is now being viewed with this primordial mind hypothesis and all that, but we go into a lot of detail about personal stories, including our own personal stories of meditation and of taking something as powerful as differential frequency brainwave entrainment and using it as a meditative tool. That's something Karen and I do in all of our workshops, meditation play shops with people, teaching them how to heal through these modalities. In fact, sacred acoustics has been very validated in a pilot study published in the peer-reviewed Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, came out in February 2020, pilot study authored by Dr. Anna Yusim, Y-U-S-I-M. And in that pilot study, she's in a busy psychiatric practice in New York City. She had a lot of very anxious patients. She found that over 2 weeks of listening to sacred acoustics, that 27% of those patients had significant alleviation, or there was 27% reduction in the symptoms of anxiety in those patients, better way to put it, compared to only 7% in the control group. So it's been scientifically validated. We're interested in doing bigger studies and really taking this forward, but it's a very powerful modality for getting into deep states of conscious awareness because these frequencies influence the lower brainstem, very different from every other sound you've ever heard, processed up in the neocortex by going to this more primitive level. Circuits that arose more than 300 million years ago in evolutionary biology. That's where the magic is. We explain all that in Living in a Mindful Universe. That's why that book has so much power, not only as a scientific statement about the understanding of consciousness in the current era and things like primordial mind and the brain as a filter, but also tremendous techniques for people to follow. So people can learn more at ebenalexander.com, at sacredacoustics.com. And I'd also like to advise your listeners, during the pandemic, for 18 months, every 2 weeks, we did interviews with the people that we weren't seeing at conferences now, other thought leaders around the world in consciousness studies, other experiencers, and people can access all those interviews for free if you go to unitedinhopeandhealing.com. And that's a website that Karen and I set up. It was all Karen's idea. She's the brains behind that operation. But those interviews are worth their weight in gold to anyone interested in these questions. And we've set up a YouTube channel on All Is Well Unlimited. But if you go to sacredacoustics.com, you can start keying into all of that.
When you spoke about your NDE in the beginning, you mentioned that you saw a woman that was of significant meaning. Who was the woman?
Well, that is a beautiful question. And this is a big spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't read Proof of Heaven, but wants to see why the millions and millions of readers were so excited by that book. It has to do with this question, this identity. And that is, to me, what shook my world to the core. And I'm not going to tell the whole story because it takes too long to do it justice. But I'll cut to the chase and simply say I was adopted. But I didn't meet my birth family until a year before my coma. And we'd already lost a beautiful member of that family who I never got to meet in this world. But if you read the book Proof of Heaven, you'll find out the absolutely gorgeous aspect of that story. And it has to do with a picture I received 4 months after my coma. But I connected all the dots. And oh my gosh, I mean, it still brings tears to my eyes to even talk about it. But that's the most beautiful part of the story. And she is still a wonderful part of my journey, figuring into my meditations on a regular basis.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful story. And so everybody should go find his books and read his books. And we're coming up to a close of this interview, but I have two more questions. And one is, what do you think is the meaning of life?
Well, I would say it's really to know thyself. I mean, that's the inscription on the temple to the oracle at Delphi in Greece. Know thyself. But in this modern world of consciousness studies, what we understand is the mind of the universe is accessible to all of us. So know thyself really means to come to find your deepest sense of purpose and meaning and relationship with the universe, your ability to discern that information and also to influence the unfolding reality. So it's to engage as the soul we came here to be. That to me is the meaning of life.
And if you could give the listeners any advice, what would it be?
Just remember that you are deeply loved and cherished by the universe. No soul left behind. This involves every single being on this planet. And it has to do with a much grander kind of collaboration that we share with the sentience throughout the universe. But it involves recovering that deep sense of love, kindness, compassion, mercy, and forgiveness that is our birthright, as given to us by prophets and mystics going back thousands of years across all belief systems. But it is time to recover that deep love for self and others that ties us all together. Just as the NDE community has made so clear, that is what will liberate us all.
Beautiful. And to learn more about Dr. Eben Alexander, you can go to his website, ebenalexander.com, and I will put that in the podcast notes as well. So you can just click on it. And I want to thank you so much, Dr. Alexander, for being a guest on the podcast today and sharing your amazing journey with all the listeners.
Well, Dr. Lottie, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me on, and thank you for getting this message out to the world. That's very important.